4 days after New Year's, sources say a casket was pulled from the ground at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Rochester. More than 24 people were at the gravesite. None were family of the deceased. Most were members of the local law enforcement community who watched as the remains were brought back to this world. The person's remains had been laid to rest 33 years ago to the day. Authorities had ordered the disinterment. It was part of an attempt to solve what may be Rochester's greatest unsolved murder mystery. From late 1971 through late 1973, 3 little Rochester girls, daughters of single mothers with little means, disappeared from their own neighborhoods. All 3 would be found a short time later. They'd been sexually attacked and strangled.
To think that this happened in my neighborhood, within the proximity of my neighborhood, I'm just a few blocks away, that she was picked up, it just upset me and my wife terribly. And we really wanted to do something to make sure this didn't happen again.
Police would recognize a chilling pattern soon after the second child was found. Victims whose first and last names began with the same letter. Each child's body was found in a town with a name that began with the same letter of the child's name. When police said the girls' deaths could be linked to a single person, the attacks became known as the double initial murders. They started something Greater Rochester had never known, a community-wide fear that a predator was on the loose. The names of the children became household names. Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, Michelle Maenza. Billboards called for witnesses. A hotline started. Citizens raised a reward fund. Leaders alerted families that children could not be left alone even in their own neighborhoods.
I remember as basically a child or a youngster hearing about it. I remember reading about it.
These 3 crimes really traumatized Rochester. They frightened parents and they frightened kids. And there were a couple of reasons for that. I think the first reason was that it happened not that long after Pamela Moss. Well, Pamela Moss was killed in 1962. She was abducted near her home in Penfield. She was strangled and then she was raped. And James Moore confessed to that crime and was convicted and went to prison. And I think that parents who remembered what happened that first time with Pamela, this just basically reinforced the kind of fear that this could happen to them. The first crime had happened out in the suburbs. These crimes were happening in the city.
The killings would stop after 2 years. No one responsible for the attacks would ever be brought to justice. After the case went cold, investigators routinely picked up the file of the double initial murders. Attempts to identify a suspect never made it to court, including the investigation of one of the nation's most notorious serial killers. A generation passed with no suspect charged.
There was such a drive to bring this person to justice that, these were very heinous crimes. And especially due to the age of the victims, I think that gives you more drive, that you want to solve it and bring closure to it for the family's sake. And a lot of effort was put in that case, a lot of hours, a lot of hard work. And to this day, it hasn't really materialized as far as, us giving us closure to it.
In the years since, within the Rochester police force, veterans passed along to officers the understanding that the double initial murders had been committed by a person that police knew, a local man who shortly after the 3rd killing had himself died.
Really, that's what makes it a mystery, is that how does someone know 3 girls with the same initials, and why does he come about murdering them and depositing them in a place with a similar initial?
Could the answer to Rochester's most infamous unsolved killings be found in the ground of a Rochester cemetery?
One of the things that has brought a lot of cold cases back to the forefront, and this would be no exception, is the availability of forensic tools that were not available to us years ago.
Rochester in the early 1970s, a time of change. The race riots of the 60s had fueled urban renewal in the city's most ethnic neighborhoods. Eastman Kodak ramped up to its most robust era. The suburbs swelled with people leaving the city of Rochester, but the Flower City was a safe place, a place where a homicide didn't happen every day and was not tolerated.
A lot of people had left the city, but many of those people still had relatives and family living in the old neighborhoods, particularly in the areas where these girls lived, the northeast side, the west side, the Bull's Head area up on Avenue D. And when a kid disappeared and was found dead, it hit them because these were children just like the children they had grown up with. These were children just like their children.
It had been a time and place that allowed children like Carmen Colon to run errands through the Bull's Head section of Rochester with concern only for looking both ways when she crossed the street. Neighbors remembered Carmen as being a hyper child. She lived with her mother at her grandparents' home on Brown Street. On November 16, 1971, Carmen ran an errand to a store where Brown Street meets Main Street on the city's west side, a pharmacy that's no longer there. Police say Carmen went to fill a prescription. When the pharmacist told her the prescription would take a few minutes, Carmen bolted out of the store. The little girl was not seen in her neighborhood again. Dozens of people would see Carmen a short time later. Police reports indicate during that evening's rush hour, Carmen was seen on Interstate 490 West, 1 to 2 miles from the Churchville exit. The little girl was seen running, nearly naked, just off the expressway. She appeared to be screaming and running from a vehicle that was seen backing up toward her. Witnesses told police a man got out of the car, eventually grabbed Carmen, and put her in the vehicle. 3 days later, 2 boys found Carmen Colon's remains in a wooded area off Stearns Road near the Churchville-Riga line. She had been sexually attacked and strangled. Carmen Colon says she locks up the memory of her daughter's death best she can, living near her 10 grandchildren and her 2 daughters. She has never granted a television interview until she and her daughters Maria and Luz sat down with us. Carmen thinks of the little girl who danced around in orange and baby blue dresses. She sees that Carmen in a portrait that hangs in her home, a portrait painted by a Rochester school bus driver she used to work with, a portrait painted shortly after her daughter was taken.
She says that she was a happy little girl, loved to play, loved to exercise, and she remembers the day that she came home, which was the last day that she seen Carmen. Carmen had some little shorts on, little shirt, was smiling and was like, "Mommy, look at me, I'm gonna do exercise." And she lifted one leg up and the other leg up, and she's like, "You see how I'm doing it?"
Luz Colon was 11 months old when she lost her sister. On that day, Luz had come home from the hospital with an ear infection. Her mother had sent Carmen to the neighborhood pharmacy to fill the prescription for Luz's ear infection. Carmen told her father to watch Carmen as she traveled on her errand.
I don't know, maybe if I wasn't sick, maybe a lot of things, I guess. I would have loved to know her, I would have had an older sister. I think of the pain that my mom feels because I think anybody as a parent, anytime you don't see your child and you think, wait a minute, either at the store or outside, wait, where's my child? And you're looking, you start feeling this, your chest tighten, and you feel like you're losing everything inside at that moment in time. I think of what she went to 3 days later to find out that her daughter was found murdered.
What made Carmen Colon's death more stunning was what police would learn as they searched for the little girl, that as many as 100 people driving on Route 490 West had seen Carmen along the highway the night she was last seen alive.
And she still thinks about it, how Carmen was running and screaming for help. And she doesn't understand how anybody that did see her didn't stop to help her, that she would stop. If she's seen any child screaming for help, she would stop, even if it cost her her life. She would know it was worth saving another child's life.
I talked to an individual who actually saw that happen. And I said, well, why didn't you stop? He said, I was going about 60 miles an hour, and by the time it registered in my head that something was wrong here, I said, I couldn't turn around and get back fast enough to do anything, that it would very probably had been all over with. But he was a prominent person in the community. He called me and told me of this story, and he felt extremely hurt. That he didn't do something, that he couldn't do something to help this girl.
Mike Macaluso grew up on Brown Street. He and his wife were raising their young family in the Bull's Head section when Carmen Colon died. He and the organization, Citizens for a Decent Community, hung half a dozen billboards like these around the neighborhood. They asked a simple question: do you know who killed Carmen Colon? If you lived here in the time of the double initial murders, your memory of that time includes the billboards.
We all were young family people at that time. I had a daughter pretty close to the age of Carmen Colon, and which set me on fire when I heard this. It was an awful thing.
The group raised a reward that eventually grew to $10,000. It also started the secret witness tip line. Volunteers manned it 24/7. It was so successful that the RPD would adopt the idea, what we know today as Crime Stoppers. One of the hotline's leads came from Syracuse and spoke of an Hispanic man who'd claimed to have done something bad to the Colon family. Rochester authorities identified that man as Miguel Colon. Guermina said he is Luz and Maria's father and Carmen's stepfather. Miguel Colon is also Carmen's uncle. After the tip came in, investigators say Miguel Colon fled to Puerto Rico. A 6-man Rochester contingent traveled there to arrest him. They did not return with their suspect, but soon after, Miguel Colon surrendered to authorities. Investigators interrogated Colon. They administered a lie detector test. Miguel Colon passed that lie detector and was released. Luz Colon and her family believes her father was targeted because at the time of Carmen's disappearance, he was receiving welfare illegally and panicked. Authorities report Miguel Colon was questioned because he could not be found in the earliest hours of the search for Carmen.
The first couple hours that they're doing the investigation, when the child disappeared, he wasn't there. But then after that, she said he was there all the time.
It still brings tears to my eyes when I see that picture. What a pretty young little girl who never lived to see life. Terrible.
Nothing pretty much shocks you anymore. Back then, it was a huge shock because those things, yes, they happened, but they weren't, everybody didn't know about everything, It was, again, a much simpler time.
In that much simpler time, Chuck Stechna was just starting out with the City of Rochester's Recreation Department. His job gave him the opportunity to provide stability for children in one of the city's at-risk neighborhoods.
I was a recreation leader at Avenue D Playground, and Wanda with her sister Rita and her mother Joyce lived right down the road, and they were there at the center a lot. So although Wanda was, 11 at that time, mature far beyond her years. And I remember her very well because she was part of the family. All the children there were, we had our regulars, and Wanda and her sister Rita were regulars.
Wanda Walkowicz, described by neighbors then as a confident tomboy. She attended school number 8. Wanda lived with her mother and 2 sisters. Her father had died of a heart attack around her 11th birthday.
I know that she was probably a very strong person. She was a fighter, meaning she would fight for herself.
Michelle Walkowicz is Wanda's youngest sister. She granted her first interview to a Rochester television station to us, in part so that she could meet the family of Carmen Colon. Michelle was 2 in April of 1973 when Wanda left school and headed towards home. Wanda paid what was then the Hillside Delicatessen on Conkey Avenue a visit. After coming out of the deli, she disappeared. 2 days later, a New York State trooper traveling along Route 104 near the Irondequoit Bay Bridge stopped at the expressway's rest stop on the east side of the bay. The trooper found Wanda's body down the bay's hillside. Wanda Walkowicz had been sexually attacked and strangled.
That was one of our little sisters, and just that it can happen, and it was that close. So everybody kind of had to reevaluate, you know, their own little lives and what they're doing and their comfort level. You know, take a look at it, and like I had said before, it just took away the innocence of the youth.
I've always been very curious, and I have no problem talking about it to people, and I'm just very open about it. And that makes me feel like this is the only way I can deal with it. She was a very, very, again, strong-willed person. Her whole family is very protective of anyone around her. If they were playing in the yard and someone was picking on one of her friends, she would, you know, say, "Come over here, I'll protect you."
Investigators would learn later Wanda had been seen speaking to someone in a car after leaving the deli near Avenue D. Authorities believe the person that killed Wanda took her in that car. It's something that didn't make sense to those who knew Wanda Walkowicz.
That's why I thought it was kind of strange, because she was very streetwise. There's no one going to talk her into a car, you know, and so don't know the situation, don't know if we ever will, but I know that she was very aware of her little environment.
She was a wonderful person. You know, her life was taken away from her too early. You know, that it should have never happened to any of these girls.
It wasn't until after the girls' remains were discovered that reporters raised the coincidence between Carmen Colon's death and the death of Wanda Walkowicz, whose remains were recovered in Webster. Wanda Walkowicz, Webster. Carmen Colon, Churchville.
It was the media who first picked up on it, that it was, well, here now we have a WW in Webster, CC in Churchville. And we began to investigate that possibility, but still it didn't really occur to anyone that maybe there was a serial killer. As a matter of fact, it wasn't really that common to consider back in the early 70s serial killer.
Well, people organize carpools to take their kids to and from school, or they walk their kids to and from school. They stopped letting their kids, in many cases, walk to the corner store to get things. Now, two of these girls disappeared when they had just gotten done at a corner store. Rochester lost a great deal, I think, of its innocence at that time, in the sense that we can't allow our children to do this.
A new set of billboards, again placed by Citizens for a Decent Community, called for witnesses to the latest crime. 1973, tainted by the specter of the attacks on the girls, passed safely. Investigators continued their work.
Investigators noticed notable differences in how the victims were treated before and after they were attacked. With Carmen Colon, her attacker faced her and used his hands at the time of her death, as compared to Wanda Walkowicz, who was strangled from behind, perhaps with ligature, perhaps even a belt. Now, Wanda had been fed prior to her attack. That was not the case with Carmen Colon. And while Carmen's remains were found mostly nude, Wanda Walkowicz's body was found mostly clothed. The time between the two killings was 16 months. But the time between the murder of Wanda Walkowicz and the next apparent victim in this string of crimes was 6 months.
Webster Crescent, a dead end off Webster Avenue at the gateway to Rochester's Market View Heights neighborhood. Michelle Maenza lived here with her mother and brother. It is just a few blocks from School 33, where 11-year-old Michelle attended school. Late November 1973, Michelle left School 33 for home. She never arrived. Police believe someone abducted her near Ackerman Street. Reporter Mike Ziegler had been on the job at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle for just a month, responding to police news when the report of Michelle Maenza's disappearance came in. Ziegler spoke with neighbors in the hours after the girl vanished.
These people were profoundly shaken by what had happened in their neighborhood, and they wanted to do something. I mean, there was one man who lived down the street from Michelle's home, and the day after she disappeared, and this would have been, she disappeared on a Monday, so the Monday after Thanksgiving, so this was a Tuesday. When he drove to and from work, he said that he looked into every car that he passed, because he figured that whoever had Michelle, if she was still alive, would have to be trying to move her somewhere. And he was hoping that he would just somehow, he would be able to see her and be able to call the police and let them know, I just saw Michelle. Of course, that never happened.
We always have said, you know, it's not going to happen in our neighborhood. Well, when the third victim was found in close proximity to where the other two had been found, it scared the community into recognition that we've got someone out there that is deranged and is using, you know, innocent children as their victim. And it scared a lot of people. A lot of people.
Richard Biscotti is the sheriff of Wayne County. Biscotti was a young Wayne County Sheriff's investigator then, working in Newark, the day Michelle Maenza's body was found along the side of a rolling rural road 2 days after she disappeared.
Either they wanted the deceased found immediately because of the amount of traffic that, I mean, it's not a highly traveled road, but there is, you know, quite a bit of traffic on it. Or the other reason was that he was in fear of getting caught with her in the car. Now, her jacket was found about a quarter of a mile down the road.
A quarter mile down Eddy Road, off Route 350, the remains of Michelle Maenza, found in the Wayne County town of Mossad. The double initial pattern stoked the community's fear. Police observed similarities between Michelle's death and the death of Wanda Walkowicz. Like Wanda, Michelle had been strangled from behind with ligature, possibly a belt. Both were found clothed, and like Wanda, Michelle had been fed before she was attacked. Witnesses had reported seeing Michelle at a Carol's Hamburger restaurant in Panorama Trail, where this Burger King now stands. The sighting provided police with their first description of a suspect in Michelle Maenza's disappearance, a man depicted in these artist sketches. It would not leave the mind of Greater Rochester either. With fear high and no arrests in a case that entered its third year, amateur sleuths began to try their hands at figuring out the method to the killer's madness.
People also tried playing amateur sleuth. I remember there was a lot of speculation about where in the alphabet these girls were. Carmen was the third letter of the alphabet, and Michelle was the 13th letter of the alphabet. Wanda was the 23rd letter of the alphabet. So people actually extrapolated that out, saying, okay, the next one would be the 33rd, which would be the letter G. So the next girl to die is going to have the letters GG, and she'll be found in Gates or Greece. So that set people's fears really on fire. People also tried to extrapolate out from a map. There was a triangle on where the girls were found outside Churchville and in Webster and in Mossad. So they tried saying, okay, well, if it's Gates, it will form this kind of a rectangle. If it's Greece, it will form this kind of a rectangle. And people were trying to predict where it was going to go.
For all of the leads that had come in over the years in the double initial murders, authorities made public only 2 suspects seriously considered in the crime. The first, Miguel Colon, Carmen Colon's uncle. He was also the father of Luz and Maria Colon. He is the man investigators had pursued to Puerto Rico. Colon returned to Rochester, passed a lie detector test, and was never charged.
They arrested him, they questioned him, they mistreated him. He had a lawyer to prove, so they could leave him alone. I think she even said they did a lie detector.
Siempre yo lo dije que él es una persona.
She never believed in that accusation on my father, that he was a very good stepfather, that he loved Carmen a lot, and that she just thinks that they just picked the wrong person.
In the late 1970s, investigators considered a new right person, a Rochester native, who made headlines on the other side of the country. Kenneth Bianchi was born to an alcoholic prostitute who put him up for adoption in the Rochester area. Adopted at age 3, doctors diagnosed Bianchi early as deeply troubled. Bianchi attended Gates Chili High School. When he was 20, he enrolled in MCC's public safety program. Bianchi wanted to be a police officer. This was at the time of the first double initial murder. Bianchi dropped out after a semester. He was rejected by the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, and later he was fired from a security job after being accused of stealing. Bianchi moved to California, where he and his cousin Angelo Buono embarked on a grisly campaign of murder that would earn them the moniker the Hillside Stranglers. From 1977 through 1978, they murdered 10 girls and women in the hills above Los Angeles. Bianchi was convicted of killing 5 of the 10 women in that spree. He was also convicted of killing 2 women in Washington State, where he now serves a life sentence. Following his arrest in California, investigators of the double initial murders pursued Bianchi as a suspect. It was reported that Bianchi once wrote a girlfriend and told her that he was a suspect in the killings. Bianchi had worked in Palmyra at the time of the double initial murders. To test whether or not Bianchi was involved, police identified an impression found on the body of Michelle Maenza. It was tested against Bianchi. The impression did not match. It moved police to eliminate the Hillside Strangler as a suspect in the case.
You get a false sense of hope that you finally got the individual, and then all of a sudden things do not materialize the way they should to bring closure to the case, and it still frustrates me, you know, from working on it that many years back. I mean, it never leaves your mind.
Authorities maintained their focus on Miguel Colon as a person of interest in the case. In 1991, investigators approached him again. They attempted to take him into custody for questioning. Miguel Colon drew a gun and took his own life.
When my father passed away, I remember very clearly 2 detectives came to our house and asked me if when my father committed suicide, did he say that he killed Carmen Colon, and that wasn't the reason why he took his life. I wish in my heart that they would find the killer.
Why does it matter? 35 years later.
One is because it would bring closure, and second of all is because for many years they have accused my father, and I want him to be proven innocent. Even though he's not here and he passed away, he went through a lot of torture back in when Carmen was missing.
What frustrates the Colon family today is that they have not heard from an investigator or police officer in years, not since Miguel Colon took his life.
You know, we try and reach out to the families, but we're at that same disadvantage in that many times we're hamstrung in the details that we can provide, because providing details and running the risk that details are made public could potentially hamper an investigation down the line.
Monroe County District Attorney Mike Green was the age of the 3 girls in the double initial murders when he was growing up in Henrietta. He joined the DA's office in the late 80s. Green has seen the case work vigorously for half the time it has remained unsolved.
Those events, you know, drive you to want to get to the bottom of things and want to find out what happened, and if someone's out there walking around responsible, you know, whether it's one person or more than one person, you know, we're going to do everything that we can.
They were 3 little girls living troubled lives.
In 2003, the Discovery Channel approached local authorities to inquire about the case. The criminal profiler, Roy Hazelwood, gathered a team of profilers to examine all of the police files of the case. The Discovery Channel probe led Hazelwood to conclude the double initial aspect of the case was more coincidence than part of a pattern. Hazelwood also believes 2 people were responsible for the killings.
Becomes more and more apparent the longer I'm involved in this case that the first murder took place out of anger toward Carmen Colon. And the last 2 murders were more what we call in the behavioral sciences as a functional type of murder. This child, this person must be killed because of the danger to me as the offender.
Hazelwood concluded the person who killed Carmen Colon, who'd been savagely attacked, left naked in a field and strangled with the suspect's own hands, may not have been the same person who killed the other 2 girls in the case. Could 2 different people have committed the double initial murders? It's a theory that measured up to one of the most widely acknowledged within the ranks of the Rochester police force, that the reason the killings had stopped was because the person responsible was already dead. Local cops had said for years that the death that ended the string of killings had also taken place much closer to the time of the double initial murders. Greg Policini decided to make a film about the infamous Rochester killing spree in 2006. Policini's movie, Alphabet Killer, will tell the story of the double initial murders through a loosely based portrayal of a retired RPD investigator who late in her career picked up the cold case.
We didn't really do that much research. We kind of took the story and are doing it in our own time in modern times and just kind of using the storyline as a basis. We're not really concerned about the actual happenings back then. Obviously, we're hoping that this type of movie brings awareness to people and obviously helping them safeguard their children. To know that these kind of people are out there is still disturbing to me.
Policini filmed the Alphabet Killer in and around Rochester, knowing that raising the memory of the murders had the potential to raise new leads into the case. To maintain the spirits of the case, Policini called on the same former officer on whose experience the film was based, Hetty Williams. She served as a consultant to the film and also appears in the movie.
The one thing that's very important with all of this is that we retain the dignity of the victims and remember that the family members are still in the area. So it was very important that we didn't sensationalize, that we stayed with the facts.
The sisters and mother of Carmen Colon and the youngest sister of Wanda Walkowicz feel their loved ones have been exploited by the movie.
They're making a movie out of it. These are people's lives. You know, she's my sister, and when you bring up something like that, my mom has to go through the emotional feelings again.
It's not a distant memory with your family, is it?
No for me.
What is it?
Para mí yo lo siento como si eso hubiera pasado ayer. No hacen 30 y pico de años, 35.
She says she remembers it today like if it happened yesterday. It's still fresh for her.
The one thing that of course, is common is their age. There were other commonalities as far as family background. The mothers were single parents. They were blue collar. There was mention that, they did mention the fact that they were on welfare, that all three girls were on welfare. However, one of them was not. But they were low income. Some of the other evidence is similar to that was recovered at the scene of the crime.
But the difference between yesterday and today in the minds of investigators is DNA.
As soon as DNA became available, of course it was talked about for many, many years that there was a possibility of doing this. As soon as it became available, every agency jumped on it. And of course there are tons and tons and tons of cases that go unsolved. And initially, with the double initial murders, we did not have that. But we did not have enough evidence to submit for DNA testing. But then when it did come about where we realized, hey, we do have this little scrap, let's go with it. Back in 2000, some evidence did resurface, and they have begun re-examining certain suspects.
They have been?
Yes.
As we speak, or are, back in 2000, or does it continue?
As we speak.
Really?
It continues to this day.
As Hetty Williams was advising the makers of Alphabet Killer, a task force moved to use today's DNA technology to answer their suspicions on one long-time person of interest in the case. On January 4th, 2007, sources tell our news police converged on Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. There, with a court-ordered search warrant, known as an Order of Disinterment, authorities pulled from the ground the remains of a man who for more than 30 years had been considered, within the ranks of the RPD, a prime suspect in the double initial murders. That man had died on a snowy morning, New Year's Day, 1974. Rochester police said that on that morning, an 18-year-old woman had been seen walking down Ashwood Drive in Rochester. A witness told police that a man who had been following the woman slowly in a car got out of the vehicle, approached the woman, and with a gun, forced the woman into a nearby garage. The witness called police. A nearby patrol officer responded and reportedly came upon a man attempting to rape the woman. The man with a gun who had heard the officer approaching ran. The officer gave pursuit. The man ran to a home on Fieldwood Drive. There, he got into a parked car. The officer reportedly spotted the man in the vehicle, approached, then backed off and called for backup. But before help could arrive, police reported a single gunshot from inside the parked car. Police say the man inside had taken his own life. The man in the car was 25-year-old Dennis Terman. He lived just a few streets away from the place where he died, on Bach Street. Terman was a 1967 East High School graduate. He'd gone on to become a Rochester firefighter, just like his father, Ben Terman, who by the time Dennis had joined the ranks was a high-ranking member of the RFD.
It had been Dennis Terman who had been considered a primary person of interest in the case of the double initial murders. Several facts which investigators would not reveal to our news led them to believe that he fit the profile of the crimes. He had been measured against the facts in this case in years past, but no charges had ever been filed. 33 years later, authorities wanted one more look.
Authorities continue to expand the use of DNA in prosecuting crimes. Just last year, Monroe County DA Mike Green successfully prosecuted a man based on DNA taken from a string of city schoolgirl rapes. With no suspect at the time of the crimes, he had the DNA indicted. Once the suspect was found in Alabama, he was extradited, charged, tried, and convicted of the attacks.
We were able to go back, and based on a hit we got in 2005, clear cases as far back as 1993, and ultimately prosecute an individual, convict him, and have him serve a sentence. It's going to keep him in for the rest of his life. And it's always our hope that that's the ideal ending. You know, that's what we hope for, is that we're able to go back and bring justice to victims or families, you know, put perpetrators where they belong and close cases the way they should be closed.
If it worked for a series of rapes from 5 or 10 years ago, could it work for 3 rape and murder cases from 35 years ago? Authorities removed Terman's remains. They took a DNA sample. They sent it to the state crime lab in Albany. 3 weeks later, they had their answer. When authorities moved forward with the search warrant of Dennis Terman's grave, they were not obligated by law to inform the family, but police did contact the Terman family. For years, they had heard the talk within the ranks of the Rochester Police Department and the Rochester Fire Department that Dennis had been considered a prospective suspect in the double initial murders. Search for the word Terman in a dictionary, and you'll find that it means an ending point. 3 weeks after testing Dennis Terman's DNA in the case, authorities learned that he would not be the ending point in the double initial murders. The DNA sample taken from Terman did not match evidence found against the second victim in the case, Wanda Walkowicz. The Terman family chose not to speak with us for this report. The case of the double initial murders would remain open. At least one Rochester family found closure in their loved one's death. We attempted to reach all of the surviving members of the victim's family still living in town. We could not locate anyone from Michelle Maenza's family. Rita DeCan chose not to speak with us. She's pictured here with her sister, Wanda Walkowicz. Wanda's death was discovered on Rita's 10th birthday. She questioned whether finding the person or people responsible for the crimes would matter to her family. Rita and Wanda's sister, Michelle Walkowicz, is glad to have met Carmen Colon's family through our report. She'd always wanted to. Michelle learned Carmen Colon had attended her sister's funeral, had hugged Michelle's mother, and wept uncontrollably at the service. Michelle also learned that at one time she and her mother lived just 2 doors down from the Colon family in the Avenue D neighborhood, and had never known it, never known they had been that close. Michelle visits Holy Sepulchre Cemetery often. It's where her sister, Wanda, and her mother rest. It is the same place where Carmen Colon and Michelle Maenza and Dennis Terman were also buried.
Does knowing what you know now change anything?
No, it's really hard to say because we don't know, who's still out there. I guess it's a relief for some people, but I never really knew what to think about who could have done this to her. But I hope they find out sometime in this century.
I feel very comfortable sitting here telling you that no stone is being left unturned. And unfortunately, that doesn't always lead to the solution that we're looking for. But I feel comfortable saying that if the solution is out there somewhere, we're going to find it.
Twice a year, Sheriff Piscotti brings his investigators together to update the investigation into the case. Thousands of leads have come in over the years. Calls spike when the case hits the media. There have been a handful of subjects on which their investigation has focused.
We become very complacent in our everyday activities, and prior to those cases being in the Rochester area, I think we kind of took a lackadaisical approach to our children as far as they were playing out on the sidewalk or they were playing in the backyard, and you really didn't pay a lot of attention because you felt you were in safe surroundings, and those days are long gone.
I would like to know. I'd like to know, if we were close to that person. Was it someone that we knew? I'd like to know how it happened too, because she was very smart, okay? And you didn't trick her or talk her into anything. She was she was very, very smart. Like I said, I keep repeating, way ahead of her years, her maturity level. And so to know how that happened, was it a person who was in wearing a uniform with authority or something like that? How did that happen? I don't need to know all the details. I don't want to know anything about the suffering, but I'd like to know what happened, how it happened. We can only learn from that.
After this 36, 7 years that these things happened, people should be more aware than ever that they have to keep an eye on their children. They just can't let their children out of their sight. They have to know where they are and who they're with. It's a terrible thing in this day and age because we've grown to be that kind of a society in this short period of time.
Did we ever get over it?
I think unfortunately we did. And I think that if something like this happened today, I don't think there would be as much concern as there was in the early 1970s. And I hate to say that, but I've covered, in covering the courts for years, I've covered a lot of really horrible cases of children being killed. I've covered cases where children were shot to death, stabbed to death, beaten to death, starved to death, burned to death. And they're all pathetic cases. And yet, I rarely hear a public outcry. I rarely hear people say, my God, how can someone do that to a child? At the time that Michelle and Wanda and Carmen were killed, that was a common thought. But now it's almost become the currency that children die in horrible ways in our neighborhoods, and it's a price of living in the city. And I think that is the fundamental change, that we have come to expect that, not only of adults dying in street corner brawls or gun battles, but we've come to expect it from our children, and we don't really seem to be that upset about it anymore. I hope I'm wrong about that.
The investigation into the double initial murders is about to take a new turn. While DNA testing has not turned up a suspect yet in this case, we've learned that authorities are prepared to investigate a new person of interest and use DNA testing. Police will not tell us who that is, but what we do know is that a string of vicious attacks against children that took place over 2 years in Rochester in the early 1970s not only changed the lives of their families, it changed the way we live in Rochester. For our news, I'm Jim Maroney.